I was 24 when this happened. I hiked alone at Piedmont Park every Saturday morning, early enough that the lot was mostly empty. That particular morning, there was one other car. There was a man standing at the trailhead when I got there, not stretching, not checking his phone, just standing completely still at the edge of the tree line with both hands in his jacket pockets, facing the woods like he was waiting for something inside them to move. I figured he was probably just catching his breath before starting, or maybe waiting for a friend who was running late, because that's a normal thing people do, and I had no reason to assume otherwise. I walked past him without making eye contact, the way you do at 6 in the morning when you're not looking for conversation, clipped my water bottle to my pack, and stepped onto the trail. The footsteps started maybe 3 minutes in. That wasn't unusual by itself. The trailhead was public. People started from the same point, and the path was narrow enough. That sound carried in a way that made someone 50 feet behind you feel much closer. But something about the rhythm felt off to me, and I kept trying to talk myself out of that feeling, because objectively, the man had every right to use the same trail I was using, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who treated a stranger like a predator just because he'd been standing quietly in a parking lot at dawn. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. I told myself he was just a guy who liked early morning hikes the same as me. I picked up my pace slightly, not dramatically, just enough to create a little more distance, and I focused on the path ahead and tried to let it go. I don't remember exactly how far I'd walked when I rounded the first long bend and looked back. He was closer than he should have been. I'd been moving fast. He'd been moving faster. He wasn't looking at the trees or the sky or anything a person looks at when they're out in nature for the pleasure of it. His head was slightly down and his eyes were fixed on the trail directly in front of him, with this focused, purposeful quality that had nothing to do with enjoying a Saturday morning. I tried to shake it off. I told myself some people just walk fast. Some people are deep in their own heads on a morning hike and don't look around at anything. And there was still no actual reason to panic, because nothing had technically happened. I pulled out my phone and shared my location with my sister, the way I sometimes did on solo hikes, framing it in my head as just a habit rather than anything urgent, and I kept walking. The trail I always took branched about a quarter-mile in. Left fork went deeper into the wooded section, where the trail narrowed and got quieter, and you could go 10 minutes without seeing another person. Right fork looped back around toward the open field near the pavilion, where dog walkers and families usually showed up by 7. I always took the left fork. That morning, I took the right without fully deciding to. My body just did it before my brain caught up with the reason, and I kept my pace even and steady the way you do when you want to look like you have a specific destination, and you've always been going this direction, and there's nothing unusual happening at all. I got maybe 40 feet down the right fork before I glanced back over my shoulder. He had stopped at the split. He was standing completely still at the fork, looking down the left trail, the one I always took, the one I had just not taken. Something about that moved through me in a way I couldn't rationalize away anymore, and I stopped trying. I walked faster, not running, but close to it. That deliberate fast walk, where your arms are moving and your eyes are fixed forward, and every part of you is focused on covering distance as efficiently as possible without triggering whatever response running might trigger in the person behind you. The right fork opened onto the field in about 3 minutes, and I could see the pavilion from the edge of the trees and 2 older men walking a yellow lab near the far end of the grass. I walked directly toward them without slowing down. I don't remember exactly what I said when I got close enough. Something about a man on the trail, someone following me. I'm not sure how coherent it came out, and one of them told me to stand with them, while the other one called the park's non-emergency line. I stood there in the open field, between these 2 strangers and their dog, and I kept my eyes on the tree line where the right fork came out. He came out of the woods about 4 minutes later. He stepped out of the tree line at the far edge of the field, and he saw the 3 of us standing together in the open, and he stopped. He stood there for a moment, in that same completely still way he'd been standing at the trailhead, and then he changed direction, without any visible reaction, cut diagonally across the far end of the field, without looking back at us, and walked to the parking lot. I watched him the whole way. He didn't hurry. He didn't look around. He just walked to his car with the same calm, unhurried quality he'd had the entire morning, got in, and drove away. I think that was the part that stayed with me most. Not that he left, the way he left. A park officer arrived about 12 minutes after that. He took my description, asked a few questions about the timeline, and told me they'd had some reports from this park over the past several months. Though he didn't specify what kind of reports or how many or what had happened in any of them, I asked him directly if I should be worried, and he told me they were looking into it, which is the kind of answer that tells you nothing and everything at the same time. I don't know what those other reports were. I don't know if he'd done this before, if there had been other women on that trail on other Saturday mornings who'd made the same calculation I made at that fork and just hadn't told anyone. I don't know if taking the right fork actually changed anything or if I'd just gotten lucky with the timing. I still don't know why he stopped at the split and looked down the trail I didn't take. Maybe he was just disoriented. Maybe he lost track of me and was trying to figure out which way I'd gone. Maybe that's all it was. I've told myself that version of it more times than I can count, and I've never fully believed it. To this day, every time I reach a trail fork, I feel it. That half second where your body decides before your brain does. I don't think that goes away. My name isn't important. What happened was 2 summers ago. I was doing landscape photography at Glacier Ridge Metro Park, alone, the way I always worked. The first thing I noticed was the car. It had been parked at the far end of the lot when I arrived at around 5:30 in the morning, and when I came back to drop off a lens attachment at my own car about 40 minutes later, it hadn't moved. That wasn't unusual by itself. Plenty of people arrived early at parks to fish or walk, and a car sitting in a lot at 6 in the morning meant nothing on its own. I grabbed what I needed, went back to the trail, and kept shooting. The light was good, and I was focused, and I told myself I was probably the only person in that section of the park for at least another hour, which was exactly how I liked it. I was maybe a half mile in when I got the feeling that someone was behind me. Not footsteps, not any specific sound I could point to, just that particular shift in awareness where the air behind you feels occupied in a way it didn't a moment ago. I stopped and turned around. The trail was empty, as far back as I could see. I stood there for a few seconds listening and heard nothing except the usual morning sounds. And I told myself it was nothing, that I'd been alone in quiet places so often, that my brain had started manufacturing company, and I turned back around and kept walking. I think that was maybe 10 minutes before I saw him for the first time. He was standing off the trail to the left, maybe 30 feet into the trees, partially behind a wide oak. He was holding a camera, a long lens, the kind used for wildlife or distance shooting, and it was pointed in my direction. I stopped walking. I looked directly at him, and he didn't move, didn't lower the camera, didn't acknowledge that I'd seen him at all. I told myself he was a wildlife photographer, because that was the most reasonable explanation, and this was a metro park, and wildlife photographers existed, and sometimes they stood in the trees at dawn because that was where the animals were. I told myself the lens was pointed past me at something behind me on the trail, a deer or a fox or a bird I hadn't noticed. I raised my hand in a half wave the way you do when you want to signal that you've seen someone and you're not a threat, and I kept walking. He still didn't move. The camera stayed up. I don't remember exactly how long I held his gaze before I turned away, but it felt longer than it was. I kept moving, and I kept shooting, and I tried to stay focused on what I'd come there to do. But something about the way he'd been standing had settled into the back of my head and refused to leave. Part of me still thought it was fine, that wildlife photographers sometimes tracked movement through a lens before acquiring their actual target, and I'd just happened to be in the sight line, and I was probably overthinking it, the way I always did, when I was alone somewhere quiet for too long. But I started paying attention to the sounds behind me in a way I hadn't before, and I started noting the distance between myself and the nearest open area, and I started moving slightly faster than I normally would on a shoot. About 20 minutes later, I stopped to set up a shot near a creek crossing, and I turned to check my back line the way I'd been doing every few minutes, and he was there, same distance, maybe 30 feet off the trail, different tree, camera up. Something about it felt wrong in a way that went past anything I could rationalize, because wildlife photographers move toward the wildlife, not toward other photographers, and there was no animal between us. There was nothing behind me on that trail worth shooting at that distance, and he had covered the same ground I had in the same amount of time while staying perfectly parallel to me through the trees without ever stepping onto the trail. I kept telling myself there was an explanation. I kept telling myself I was constructing a narrative out of coincidence because I was alone, and my brain was doing what brains do in quiet, isolated places. I packed up my tripod and I started back toward the parking lot, not running, just walking with purpose. And I pulled out my phone and called my partner and told him where I was and that I was heading back to the car and that I'd explain when I got there. I didn't tell him about the man. I don't know why. I think I still wasn't ready to say it out loud because saying it out loud would make it real. I was about 10 minutes from the lot when I heard him on the trail behind me. Actual footsteps this time, on the path, no longer in the trees, and they were moving at a pace that was closing distance. I turned around. He was on the trail now, maybe 60 feet back, camera down at his side, walking directly toward me at a speed that had nothing casual about it. I turned back around, and I walked faster. Not running. I was aware in some part of my brain that the trail was narrow here, and that running would tell him exactly how afraid I was. And I had no idea what that information would do, so I just walked as fast as I could move, without breaking into a full run, and I focused on the parking lot, and I kept my phone in my hand, and I did not look back again. I heard his footsteps the whole way. They never stopped. They never slowed down. They just kept coming at that same steady closing pace the entire time. I got to the parking lot, and there were two cars there now besides mine. A woman loading a stroller from her trunk, and a man in running gear stretching near his sedan. I walked directly to the woman and stood next to her and started talking to her about nothing, about the trail, about the morning, and she looked slightly confused, but she kept talking because that's what people do when a stranger starts a conversation. I heard the footsteps come out of the trail behind me and stop. I didn't turn around for about 30 seconds. When I did, the man was standing at the trailhead at the edge of the lot. He was looking at me. Then he turned around and walked back into the park. I sat in my car for a long time before I drove away. The other car, the one that had been there when I arrived, was gone. I don't know if it was his. I called the park's main line when I got home and reported what had happened, and they told me they'd send someone to check the area and that I should call 911 if anything like that happened again. I don't know if anyone ever went out there. I don't know if he was photographing me or if the lens had genuinely been pointed at something else both times and I'd built the whole thing out of coincidence and fear. I still don't know, but I've thought about it enough times now that I've started to wonder, something I can't stop wondering. My shoot that morning was posted on my photography page the night before, location tagged. Start time in the caption. I'd been doing that for 2 years, tagging every location, every early morning shoot. I don't do that anymore, but that's not the part I think about. The part I think about is how many times I posted before that morning, how many locations, how many start times, and whether that car was ever in any of those lots before I learned to look for it. I was 29 when this happened. I'd been running the same trail at Worden Park 3 times a week for almost 2 years. The park felt different the morning I saw them. They were already at the shelter when I arrived. A man and a woman sitting at the picnic table closest to the trail entrance, facing outward in a way that felt less like resting and more like waiting. The man had his hands flat on the table, and he was watching the parking lot with the kind of stillness that didn't match anything about the morning. The woman was looking at her phone, but she wasn't scrolling. The screen was dark, I noticed all of that in the few seconds it took me to walk from my car to the trailhead. And then I was on the trail, and I told myself I was reading too much into two people sitting at a park shelter at 7 in the morning. Because people did that, families did that, couples did that, and there was nothing objectively wrong with anything I'd just seen. I put my earbuds in and started my run, and let the rhythm of it take over the way it always did. I was about a mile in when I passed a woman walking her dog coming the other direction. She was moving fast, and her dog was pulled close on a short leash, and she had that particular look people get when they've decided to leave somewhere, and they've decided it quietly. I nodded at her, and she nodded back and kept going, and I told myself she was just someone in a hurry, maybe running late for something. Maybe the dog had been acting up. I kept running. I don't remember exactly what it was that made me look back over my shoulder about 30 seconds after she passed me, but when I did, I could see her at the far end of the straightaway, turning back once to look behind her, and she was looking at the trail behind me, not ahead of her. I slowed down slightly. I pulled one earbud out. The trail behind me was empty as far as I could see. The second time I saw the couple, I was 2 miles in at the halfway shelter. They were there, same position, same stillness. Man with hands flat on the table, woman with a dark phone screen, both of them facing the trail. I hadn't seen them pass me. There was no way to get from the first shelter to the second without either using the trail or cutting through about a quarter mile of dense brush that ran along the park's east edge, and I hadn't seen anyone on the trail between those 2 points. I stopped running. I stood on the trail about 30 feet from the shelter, and I looked at them, and the man looked back at me with an expression that had nothing readable in it. I told myself there was a maintenance road or a fire access path somewhere in the brush that I didn't know about, because I hadn't been here long enough to know every inch of this park, and that was the most logical explanation, and I was probably just disoriented from the run and misremembering the trail layout. I started running again. The man watched me the entire time I was in sight of that shelter. I could feel it even after I'd rounded the next bend. Something about the mechanics of what I'd just seen refused to settle. I kept turning it over while I ran, kept trying to find the version of it that made ordinary sense, and I kept coming back to the same problem. The timeline didn't work. Even if there was a road through that brush I didn't know about, they had been sitting at that second shelter with the same composed, unhurried stillness as the first, which meant they hadn't just arrived, which meant they'd moved ahead of me at some point while I was running and had enough time to get settled before I got there. That meant they knew where I was going before I got there. I told myself I was constructing something paranoid out of a coincidence I didn't fully understand, and I picked up my pace and focused on getting to the end of the trail. I came out at the north end of the loop, where the trail rejoined the main path back to the parking lot, and I pulled out my phone to check my time, and I saw a text from a number I didn't recognize. It had come in 12 minutes earlier, while I was running. It said, "Nice pace," 2 words, no punctuation. I stopped moving. I stood on the path and looked at the message, and then I looked at the number, and I didn't recognize it, and I looked at the timestamp, and I thought about where I'd been 12 minutes ago on the trail and what had been visible from the second shelter at that point in my run. I told myself it was a wrong number, someone texting the wrong contact, because that happened all the time, and there was no reason to assume it was connected to anything, and I was already constructing a narrative out of things that probably had completely separate explanations. But my hands weren't steady when I put the phone back in my pocket, and I didn't put my earbud back in, and I didn't slow down for the rest of the way back. The couple was gone when I got to the parking lot. The shelter closest to the entrance was empty. There were 2 other cars in the lot that hadn't been there when I arrived, and I didn't know which one had been theirs, or if they'd come in a car at all. I sat in my car with the doors locked, and I looked at the text again, and I thought about responding to it, and then I thought about what responding would confirm, which was that they had the right number, and I didn't respond. I called my brother instead and told him what had happened, in a way that I could already hear. Sounded unlikely when I said it out loud, a couple at two different shelters, a text from an unknown number, a woman with a dog who'd looked back at me, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that I should report it, which I did. And I called the Parks Department non-emergency line and told them what I'd seen and gave them the unknown number, and they told me they'd look into it and to call back if anything else happened. Nothing else happened that day. I went back to that trail 4 days later because I wasn't going to let it take something from me that I'd had for 2 years, and the park was ordinary, and I ran the full loop without anything feeling wrong, and I checked both shelters, and as they were empty. I blocked the number when I got home that first day, and I don't know if they ever tried to contact it again after that. The Parks Department never followed up with me. I don't know who those two people were, or how they moved between those shelters, or whether the text was connected, or whether I'd been watching a completely ordinary couple whose behavior I'd filtered through fear and turned into something it wasn't. I've thought about all of those possibilities enough times that I've stopped being sure which one I believe. But there's one thing I haven't been able to explain away, no matter how many times I've tried, and it's not the shelters and it's not the text. It's the woman with the dog, the way she had been moving, the way she'd looked back at the trail behind me, the way her dog was pulled in tight. She'd seen something before I got to that second shelter. She'd been coming from the direction of it, and she hadn't said a word to me when we passed each other, hadn't slowed down, hadn't warned me. To this day, I wonder if she'd tried to and just couldn't find a way to say it fast enough, or if she'd looked at me and made a calculation I didn't know she was making and decided the fastest way to be safe was to keep moving and not look back. I think about that a lot. The things people decide not to say when they're afraid. This happened 3 years ago. I was training for a half marathon, and Shelby Farms Park had the best long trails within driving distance. I always ran alone. The man was on the bench at the first water station when I passed it, about a mile into my run. He was sitting with both elbows on his knees and his head slightly down, not drinking, not stretching, not doing anything a person at a water station does. I noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit without being able to name what's wrong with it. And then I was past him and moving, and I told myself he was probably just tired, probably just someone taking a break mid-run who needed a minute. And I put him out of my mind and focused on my pace and my breathing and the 12 miles I still had ahead of me. The trail at Shelby Farms looped through several different sections, open fields, wooded corridors, a long stretch along the lake, and I knew it well enough by that point that I ran it mostly on autopilot, which meant my brain had space to wander. About 2 miles in, I started thinking about the man on the bench again, without meaning to. I kept trying to identify what it was about him that had snagged my attention, and I kept coming back to the same thing. He hadn't been sweating. It was late August, and the humidity was the kind that sits on you from the first step out of a car, and I was already soaked through by the time I'd passed him, and he'd been completely dry. I told myself maybe he'd just arrived, maybe he'd driven to that water station somehow, maybe I'd imagined it, or hadn't looked closely enough to actually know whether he was sweating or not. I kept running. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. I saw him again at the 4-mile marker, near the wooden footbridge that crossed the creek in the wooded section. He was standing at the near end of the bridge, with his arms at his sides, facing my direction, not checking his phone, not looking at the creek, just standing there in the middle of the path, the way you'd stand if you were waiting for something specific to come toward you. I slowed to a walk before I reached the bridge because the path narrowed there, and there wasn't room to pass someone at a run without getting close. And as I got closer, I watched his face. And his face didn't change at all. No acknowledgement, no slight shift of the body to make room, no eye contact. I said, "Excuse me," and moved past him on the left where there was maybe a foot of path between him and the railing. And as I passed him, I was close enough to confirm what I'd noticed at the water station. Dry shirt, dry hair, not a drop on him. It was 91 degrees, and he hadn't broken a sweat, and something about that felt wrong in a way I couldn't locate precisely, but couldn't dismiss either. I picked up my pace after the bridge. Not dramatically, just enough to put distance between us quickly. And I kept moving through the wooded section and told myself there was a reasonable explanation I wasn't thinking of, that some people just didn't sweat much, that some people had medical conditions, that I was inventing a threat out of a dry shirt and a man who stood too still, and none of that constituted anything real. I don't remember exactly how far I'd run after the bridge before I stopped noticing the sound of anyone behind me. But at some point, I did stop noticing it, and I let myself believe I'd lost him, or that he'd turned around, and I settled back into my pace and my breathing, and the run started to feel normal again. That lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then I came around the long bend near the lake, and he was there ahead of me, sitting on the grass about 15 feet off the path, facing the water. Same dry shirt, same stillness. I stopped running. I stood on the path and did the math. And the math didn't work. I had been running continuously since the bridge. He had been behind me at the bridge. The trail between the bridge and the lake bend didn't branch. There was one path, and I'd been on it the entire time, and I hadn't been passed, and I hadn't seen anyone come from the other direction. For him to be ahead of me at that point, he would have had to leave the trail and cover the same distance through the brush alongside it, which was dense enough in that section that you couldn't move through it quietly. And I hadn't heard anything off-trail the entire stretch. I kept telling myself there was an explanation, that maybe I'd missed a branch in the trail I didn't know about, that maybe there was a maintenance path or a shortcut that wasn't on the map I'd memorized, that I was frightening myself over something that had an ordinary answer I just didn't have access to yet. But I wasn't running anymore. I was standing on the path looking at a man who had appeared ahead of me without passing me. And my body had made a decision my brain was still arguing with. I turned around. I know the standard advice is to keep moving toward the populated area, toward the exit, toward other people. And normally that would have meant continuing in the direction I'd been going. But the parking lot where I'd left my car was behind me, and it was a mile and a half back the way I'd come. And there was a family I'd passed near the 2-mile marker, flying a kite in the open field. And that was the direction I went. I didn't run in a way that looked like fleeing. I ran the way a person runs when they've decided to cut a training session short, steady, and deliberate. And I did not look back for the first 4 minutes because looking back meant losing time, and I needed every second of distance I could build. When I finally did look back, the path was empty. I kept going. The family was still in the field when I came through. A father and 2 kids. The kite about 40 feet up in the thick August air. I slowed as I passed them and looked back down the trail, and there was no one there. I stayed within sight of them until I reached the section that opened back toward the parking lot, and then I covered that last stretch fast and got to my car and locked the doors and sat there with the engine running. I didn't see him in the lot. I didn't see him anywhere. I sat there for a long time, trying to reconstruct the geometry of what had happened and find the place where it made ordinary sense, and I couldn't find it. I've looked at maps of that trail online since then, looked for unmarked paths or service roads running parallel to the lake section, and I found one, a narrow maintenance track that ran along the outer edge of the wooded section and connected back to the lake trail, about a quarter-mile ahead of where I'd seen him on the grass. I've looked at that on the map more times than I can count, and told myself that's what it was, that he'd known about that track and used it, and that there was nothing more complicated happening than a man who knew the park better than I did and had no particular interest in me. I've told myself that version so many times I almost believe it. Almost. The part I can't make fit is the water station at mile 1, the bridge at mile 4, the lake bend at mile 6, 3 times, spaced almost exactly 2 miles apart. Like he'd known every stop I was going to make before I made it. I still don't know if that was planning or coincidence. I don't know if those 2 things were ever really different in this situation. I go back to that park sometimes, and I run that same trail because I refuse to let it become a place I'm afraid of. But I always know where the maintenance track is now. I always know exactly where it comes out.